Hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy New Year, and thank you so much for joining us today for their professional development workshop, Moving from Employee Connectivity to Employee Belonging. The Duluth Chamber is very grateful to provide this offering free of charge for our chamber members in 22 because of the generosity of our sponsor, the College of St. Scholastica Stender School of Business and Technology. So at this time, I'm really happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Bob Randall. Now, Dr. Randall is the Assistant Professor of Management at the Stender School of Business and Technology and is the new Director of the MBA program in Leadership and Change. So congratulations for that. We're super lucky to learn from him today on the opportunities for your organization to create a culture of belonging. So thank you so much for speaking for us today, Dr. Randall, and for representing the Stender School of Business and Technology. So please take it away.
All right, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you today and excited to kick off the 2022 learning series. So how cool is that? As we get started with everything today, as Chris said, I'm representing the St. Scholastica Stender School of Business and Technology. And I personally am teaching in the MBA Leadership and Change program, which is a program that we deliver primarily online through Zoom like this. So we meet on Tuesday and Thursday nights. And if you're ever interested in learning more about leadership and change, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about those opportunities. So with today's program really kicking off here on January 5th, I thought it would be kind of interesting and kind of fun maybe to reflect a little bit on what our hopes are for 2022 before we dive into the materials. So if you wouldn't mind maybe just thinking about that and sharing your just one hope that you have for this year, whether it's a personal hope or something for your organization or society in general. We'd love to share those in the chat to kind of get things going as we really kick off this new year in 2022. So we invite you to put that in the chat. I'll kind of read through a couple of them as we get going. Love to hear about this, of course, increased health and well-being. And certainly what we're talking about today ties into that. And another one is being more organized. That's always a good goal to start out the year. Doing work that feels meaningful. I think we're going to touch on that quite a bit today as we look at some of the statistics coming out and what people are doing, moving around, looking for meaningful work is certainly one of the things. I love this one, learn how to play the violin. How cool is that? No better time than now, right? To do those types of things. Seeing more family and friends and doing it safely. That sounds amazing. Growing, we're going to talk about that. Certainly we need employees to be engaged and we need good talent on board to be able to grow, making connections and in-person connections and doing that safely. I sure hope that we can do more of that too. We're certainly not necessarily starting out the year that way, but I think we all have a lot of hope that we're going to be doing that as we get into the year. And then enhanced employee ownership of the mission and vision. And certainly when we talk about belonging as an employee, that certainly ties into that. And then for 4 years, learning to quit has been on my list. This is the year. All right. I'm sorry, not quit, quilt. That's even better. So I love those types of hobbies that people are looking to accomplish. Being a better active listener, being more disciplined, helping my team reach their potential. Certainly that's what it's all about. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I thought it would be kind of fun to kind of kick things off that way. I know for me, it feels like in the last couple of years, especially through the pandemic, businesses particularly have adapted very quickly to being adapting to the new reality of the pandemic. And technology certainly has been a huge enabler for that. And so what we're going to talk a lot about today is how we move from just connectivity. We're able to connect this way through Zoom, through other technologies, but how do we create a sense of belonging, even in this virtual environment and in this very fast-paced environment too? I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm working even longer hours, even though I'm really working from home, and I kind of have this flexibility, which is great, but my day is packed. And I think a lot of employees kind of feel that as well. And at the end of the day, it can be very draining. So how do we stop during our day and create a sense of belonging and a different level of connectivity with each other as well? So what we talk a lot about when it comes to connectivity is really the process. So the changes that we've experienced certainly have been something that we had to react to very quickly, but how has that process for change really worked? And what we mean by that is where are the decisions coming from? Who's involved in those decisions? Are we following up to see the impact of those decisions and those changes, to see how people feel about them, how they connect to them? So I'll give you one example on a change I was involved in. Before I became a professor, I was working in the corporate world for quite a while. And at one point, I was managing a factory down in the southern part of Georgia, near Savannah. And at the time, this is about 10 years ago, demand was skyrocketing for our products. And so the whole idea was like ramp up and ramp up fast. And so the whole, as I moved into that factory position, the whole thing was like, how do we find employees and find them fast? And so we hired very, very quickly and as fast as we could to try to meet the demand that we were facing. And I can tell you that the process that we used was just basically any warm body, let's get them on the factory floor and get them going. And we didn't really think about the process for change very much. In retrospect, as I think back, and some of the problems with that process that we used, because we weren't as thoughtful or intentional about the changes that we were making as we ramped up and expanded, is that we kind of ended up with a workforce that felt very disconnected. Our quality levels actually went down and our turnover rate went up. We kind of ended up in this whole churn kind of mentality. And it really, I think in the long run, kind of hurt the business. And so I think in many cases, as we reacted to the pandemic and made all these quick changes that have occurred over the last couple of years, and we continue to make changes, I wonder how many organizations kind of are reacting in a similar way, which is like, oh, I'm so tired, and not thinking about the process of change, but more about just like getting the change done and then moving on. So I think it would be a good idea to think at this point about like, we've kind of worked very hard on safety protocols, on working remotely and being flexible, but now let's think about how we create a sense of belonging for employees. And I'll show you some statistics here very shortly about what that looks like for employees. So I'm going to share my screen now and just kind of show you some content that we have around that idea. So the slide that you see here, I think is really interesting. And there's some updates to it I'll share with you now as well. In the short run, as you may be aware, the title of the slide here is The Great Resignation, right? But I just received a report this morning that in the month of November, a record number of people actually quit their jobs. 4.5 million people quit their jobs in the month of November. That doesn't mean that people are necessarily at this point leaving the workforce, but at a breathtaking rate, people are switching jobs because another almost a million jobs were created in the same time frame. And so at the current rate, we have about 10.5 million job openings, which is the most ever. That's more than we ever had before the pandemic. And we have about 7 million people looking for jobs in the United States. So we have far fewer people looking for jobs than we have job openings. We have way more job openings than we have people. And at the same time, wages are rising 3 to 5%, which is much, much higher than we've seen in decades. And so what we're learning is that a lot of the reasons people are giving for why they're quitting their job, why they're looking for new positions, is they're looking for flexibility, they're concerned about their health. Workers also know they're more in the driver's seat than they used to be. So in the short run, we know that this is happening, and there's just a tremendous amount of turnover occurring in the workforce. In the long run, what's interesting, I remember 3 or 4 years ago doing some research in this area and actually giving some presentations to SHRM groups and chambers and things of that nature, talking about how in the long run, we're gonna have a worker shortage. And so what the pandemic did is it just accelerated that. We were on this 10-year path to have a worker shortage, kind of like what we have now. It just happened over a 2-year period because of the pandemic. And so if you're wondering when this phenomena is going to go away, well, it really is not going to go away. This phenomena of a worker shortage, the war for talent, those types of things is going to continue for a very long time. And that's because our demographics in the United States, we knew this was coming because immigration has been much lower and is even lower now because of the pandemic. And also the birth rate is much lower as well. So we're bringing fewer people into the workforce. And meanwhile, there's an appetite and a demand for the economy to grow. And it's really the worker shortage that is really hindering the opportunities for growth. So organizations where maybe in the past it was like, oh, we lost a couple people, let's just hire some new people. Well, there aren't job applicants like we used to have. And so we have to rethink, number one, how we keep the talent that we have, how we engage the people that we have, and then how we present ourselves as a wonderful place to work. What are people really looking for? So this whole idea of belongingness really, really resonates for the workforce today. So we're going to really dive deep into that. So as we know, more people are also working from home, because of the pandemic. And that was a trend, again, in the big picture. We knew that was going to continue over a decade or more, where more and more people were going to have the opportunity and demand to work from home. But with the pandemic, it happened overnight. And at the same time, we also know that people aren't as engaged sometimes when they work from home either. There's sort of a missing component that's occurring. And part of that is true connection and belongingness with their teams, with their coworkers, with their boss. So we're going to really dive into that. But I'm sure you all know that meetings and gatherings were canceled in person. And probably when we come back to a more normal state or a more stable state, a lot of that is going to come back in more of a hybrid format, as I'm sure you're thinking about today. So, as I mentioned, more people working from home and being connected through technology, but more and more people are feeling disconnected. So we also know that prior to the pandemic, employee engagement was still challenging for employers, but it's even more challenging today. And part of that is the fact that we're not necessarily housed in the same building on a regular basis with our coworkers. And so more employees are feeling overwhelmed as well since the pandemic started, and also feeling disconnected. And so at its core, people feeling disconnected is because the change has happened so fast, and we're still figuring out the issues, the wake that was created because of that change as well. And so this abrupt move to remote work has exacerbated the engagement crisis that we had prior to the pandemic. And so one thing we have to remember is that being connected does not equal a sense of belonging. So of course, technology allows us to connect, but how does that affect the human psyche, the human sense? And we're really missing some of those things we used to complain about in order things that we took for granted. So the random chit chat that occurred at work, Someone might pop into your office, and maybe that might be annoying because they're interrupting your work, but somebody might ask about your weekend or your kid's soccer match. Well, it can be a little annoying, but at the same time, you made a connection with somebody on a personal level. And that can be, again, in our subconscious, it can activate very positive feelings within ourselves. Of course, water cooler talk isn't happening, those random connections that you might make, oh, I just found out my coworker took a cool vacation to Glacier National Park. Now I know that person on a more personal level. If I have to ask them for help or ask them for something, I'm asking them on a more human level than just through an email on somebody I've never really spoken to or gotten to know on a personal level. And so those natural things that were happening on a personal level just aren't happening through technology like they were when we were in person. So it's kind of important to kind of think back to like, well, why is belonging, important to people? Well, it is a basic human need. And so when you look at the pyramid on the right, that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you might remember that from your college days. But it's kind of nice to revisit that and think through where that kind of comes up for people. And as you see it on the right, you can see, once we take care of our physiological needs, our need for food, shelter, things of that nature. And in the workplace, we think about that typically in terms of compensation and benefits to provide for ourselves and our families. And then we have a need for safety, and that can happen in the physical sense, but it also can happen in a psychological way. And so psychological safety and belonging, I think, kind of intertwine with each other. And of course, belonging is the third rung on the pyramid that you see here. And belonging is a human need that we have to think about as employers. That is an employee need as well. So how do we create a sense of belonging for employees as we, are trying to connect through these technologies? The other thing to think about is the brain. So when a sense of belonging is lacking, what do we have? People view that as a threat. When there's a lack of belonging, the brain views that as a threat when there's not a sense of belonging. In other words, someone's out to get me. The brain just functions that way. And we know that from the Neurological Leadership Institute and other places that have done a lot of research in that area. And the whole thing is that the human brain is wired from thousands and thousands of years ago. It dates back to the beginning of humanity, where the brain was trained to look for threats first. The saber-toothed tiger that was around the corner. And when our needs are not being met, when our sense of belonging need is not being met, we're really activating what we call the prefrontal cortex in the brain. And we mitigate that threat response when we do get a sense of belonging, and we're able to operate and interact with each other, not out of a sense of fear when we have a sense of belonging, but out of a shared sense of purpose. And so that's why belonging is so very important. We can't get to a shared sense of purpose unless we feel connected and a sense of belonging and connection and true connection with each other. The other benefits of belonging are better physical health and immune response. So there are other physiological benefits to a sense of belonging. But of course, a lack of belonging dissipates those things. And so again, the science is with us when we talk about a sense of belonging being a human necessity. So other things we can learn come from nature. So this is really interesting. So we used to think that trees competed with each other for natural resources, kind of like a zero-sum game. We used to think that trees were competing with each other for water, for nutrients, for sunlight. And some people view the human experience that way, kind of took that old way of scientific thinking of zero-sum game into the way they thought humans were in competition with each other to gain status, to gain wealth and power over others. Well, we now know through more recent research that in scientific research that our past assumptions about trees have been all wrong. Trees are deeply interconnected with each other. In fact, the Smithsonian Institute calls trees communal in that they form alliances with each other and collectively work with each other to survive and flourish, warding off predators, other plants and vegetation that might be working against their own species. So trees are connected at their roots. They're intertwined underground, and their roots are oftentimes indistinguishable from each other. In other words, their roots are shared. They're a shared sense of belonging with each other. In fact, roots are so interconnected, one German scientist calls them the wood wide web, which I think is kind of cute and funny, but also kind of exemplifies the whole point. So trees live in communities where forests exist, where they share water, resources, nutrients, and other things. And small trees in that same forest would not survive for lack of sunlight and those same nutrients, except the big trees from the same species feed their roots sugar to help them grow and flourish into mature trees. So maybe you're starting to make the connection to humans. What does that have to do with us? Again, perhaps it's time to rethink our worldview and realize that we're actually all connected. We need each other. Connection and belonging are life, just like they are for trees. And living collectively is not only a healthier way to live, but it's the only way humans can progressively evolve. So in this pandemic, we may need to physically distance at times, but we can still connect emotionally with each other. In quantum physics, in ancient traditions and many worldwide religions tell us that we are our thoughts. If I pray for someone or send somebody warm thoughts and good vibes, I'm sending them something warm and fuzzy, but I'm also sending them positive energy. And in quantum physics, I'm sending them subatomic particles that are healing in nature. So living collectively with large open hearts works. And while it's easier to connect in person, we can do so remotely as well. And today we'll provide some real life ways leaders and organizations can help their employees connect in ways that promote belonging. So let's bring this back to organizations. I touched on employee engagement for a second a little bit earlier, but what I want to talk about now is how creating a sense of belonging is not only the moral thing to do, as we just talked about. We already know that we need each other, but it's the best thing to do for organizational wellness too. So this Great Resignation, it's also interesting to know when we talk about the Great Resignation and people leaving the workforce, that's really spurred by older people. And the data shows that people that are 50 years or older are the vast majority of those leaving the workforce. And that's people saying, I've had enough. My life is not about this. And so how do we create a sense of belonging? Because once we do that, then we can create a sense of purpose with each other. But even worse, what happens to the people that aren't leaving, that are disengaged? They're on the payroll, but they're not fully engaged. That if you just think about the dollars and cents and put the morality of all that aside, those are people with a cost that are not giving out any production. So let's take the more appreciative point of view. Imagine an organization that gets this right. They're going to thrive and have a bright future, but it's going to take oftentimes adjustments and different approaches to help make that happen. So what are we talking about? What is belonging? What does this word mean? Here's I think a really good definition from Rhodes Perry, who wrote a book on belonging. All employees want to be part of something and feel like their work and voices matter. It's a sense of fitting in or feeling like you're an important part of a group. So it's a pretty simple definition, but it's a good reminder on what we're talking about. And there's certainly an element of diversity, equity, and inclusion that comes with this too. It doesn't mean that you have to be part of a marginalized group to feel a lack of belonging, but there's also some structural elements in our society that we have to pay attention to know that there are marginalized and structural issues within our society and sometimes within our organizations that make marginalized groups feel othered. And so when this presentation or this discussion isn't focused on DEI because that is a whole nother topic that requires a lot more time and attention. But it's good to be reminded on when we talk about DEI, what those things mean. We put some definitions up here on the screen. Again, these definitions are taken from Rhodes Perry and from some other thought leaders in the space, where diversity, of course, is just where a variety of people exist with different backgrounds. But inclusion is where people actually feel welcomed. And then the really complex issue that, again, requires a lot more time and attention than we have for today's discussion is dealing with the historical structural barriers and trying to remove those so that all people have access to success. So I just put this in here as a reminder, not, again, we don't have time to really dive into it and give it the attention it needs, but it's also an important fact that we'll work through as we talk further. So the other thing I want to talk about now is about who's responsible for creating a sense of belonging. And I like to start with the direct manager. We know through research, Gallup and others, that the frontline manager is responsible for up to 70% of an employee's engagement. So people don't quit their jobs, they quit their boss. Or people aren't engaged necessarily just because the organization is wonderful. They're engaged because they have a strong connection with their boss. I'll give you one example. My husband used to work, he's been a car nut. He grew up in Michigan and the Detroit area and gets all the car magazines. And he got his dream job a few years ago at Tesla. He worked for Tesla and worked with the corporate office and worked remotely and was so excited to be part of that movement toward electric vehicles. And right away, he enjoyed it. He had a wonderful boss right away, really connected with him and had a great experience. And then he got moved into a different position, a different group, a different boss, and everything changed. The stress level went up, he felt disconnected, and he ended up having to leave. He had to leave because of his emotional health. In fact, the company knew that they were overworking their people to the point where they were paying for unlimited therapy for his group of workers. And he's like, well, if that isn't a red flag, I don't know what is. And so unfortunately, he had to leave the auto industry. He's in a much better corporate position now outside of the auto industry and really loves where he is, mainly because he loves his boss. He loves the people, he loves the culture. And again, that frontline manager plays such a huge role in somebody's experience. Just a little bit of egghead theory here. Leader-member exchange theory is just reminding frontline workers that as employees appear to get on board with the leader's vision, the leader invests more time with the employee and their relationship with that employee. So this symbiotic relationship really elevates as the manager is helping the employee's on board, there's a connection, and the level of engagement really flourishes. The other thing to keep in mind, and we know this through research, is that leaders do not treat all employee relationships the same. They invest a lot more time in employees whom they trust and connect with. So the idea here isn't that, well, of course, that kind of makes sense, right? But the idea here is what can we do to help leaders, frontline managers in particular, build trust and connection with all of their employees, or more of their employees, at least to start with. Maybe they're not going to get 100% of their employees to that level of relationship, but building a personal connection, a personal relationship with each of their employees really should be part of the equation and really will pay dividends, not only for that manager, but for the organization as a whole. Because we really need to work and help give frontline managers more resources, more tools and training to help them know how to do those things and to help also make them know how important it is and what the benefits are. And of course, on the flip side of that, what happens when those things don't happen? Well, of course, that manager is going to be spending more time hiring new people as turnover continues to ensue. And of course, being that hamster on the wheel is something that needs to happen, but oftentimes is very unproductive, rather than just really focusing on the people that you have. Another thing, and then again, this kind of goes back to DEI, which I touched on a little bit ago, is that one size does not fit all for a modern leadership approach. And so sometimes managers are like, we'll treat everyone the same, and kind of this meritocracy will ensue. Well, it doesn't mean that meritocracy doesn't matter, but we also know that different employees have different needs. So maybe you've seen this image before, but the idea here is, how do you find out from your employee what their particular needs are, so you can identify those and provide them the training and the support that they need, because everybody is wired differently and has different abilities. And so the modern leader, again, will spend time getting to know their employee on a personal level, building the trust, having those rich conversations, and then determining how they can have a more impactful relationship and provide that support and trust with each of their employees. So here's a model for interpersonal model for belonging. Again, this comes from Rhodes Perry again. And again, it's kind of simple in a way, but it's also can be a really nice tool, again, to help that managers. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road, is that direct relationship and those direct interactions that people have with each of their employees. And the idea is to spend some time with each employee. And I know when we say time, it's like, oh, I don't have time. Well, when we're the hamster on the wheel and we don't feel like we ever have time, we have to get off of the wheel sometimes and just go, what we're doing right now isn't working. So why don't we try something different? Why don't we take a breath, go slow to go fast? So that's the idea here. I kind of mentioned my experience back in Georgia, which is like, let's just ramp up and go. Where if we would have taken a more thoughtful approach, we could have built a more sustainable culture, and we would have had much, much better results. And I think the same thing goes when we're talking about a manager who might have 6, 7, 8 people reporting to them. It's taking time to get to know each of those employees, responding to their needs, holding them accountable, certainly, but doing that in a more servant leadership approach. And that approach can be really helped by, I think, this model. Of course, acknowledging the other person's feelings. Again, that takes a personal level of trust to be able to talk about feelings with an employee. Letting the other person know that they are not alone. Letting them know that you're there for them. And again, maybe the position at the end of the day is not exactly correct for that person. And maybe your job as a manager is to really coach them into a position where they can be successful. But again, taking on a leadership role means, number one, it's a choice. So you're choosing to be a modern leader. And are you willing to put that investment, your emotional investment, into that job? And then number two, having the skills to be able to do it. And that's where this model, I think, can be really helpful, is helping build those interpersonal skills to be able to connect to your employees. And then as the manager, you can do that one-on-one or with your group, but practicing vulnerability as well. So again, I tried to do a little bit of that at the beginning, but sharing kind of like, oh, so here's some lessons learned that I had as a leader in a factory in the southern part of Georgia. We made some mistakes. We could have done better. And here's what I think could have been better. And this is also based on some of the feedback I got from our employees there. But also realizing that your story of vulnerability should not subjugate someone else's. And this oftentimes happens, I think, when an employee might share like, oh, I'm really having a problem with so-and-so on the team. And then you say, oh, well, I once had a problem with somebody and blah, blah, blah. It's like, your experience may not be exactly what theirs was. So practicing vulnerability is good. It's like, oh, I had a problem, but their experience might be a little bit different. So that's where we don't want to subjugate somebody else's experience, But we also want to be able to share what our own experience is, knowing that it might be different than someone else's. And then practicing what we call appreciative inquiry. So this is where there's a great model around this, the 4D model, around helping people realize, well, what brought you to this position to begin with? What's the best part about this job that you really truly love and get excited about? And then kind of taking that appreciative inquiry into the next level, which is the dream level, which is what if we could reconstruct this job for you, throwing all constraints to the side, what would it look like? And then taking it to the next level, which is design, which is now let's kind of come down from 30,000 feet to 1,000 feet. And let's talk about, what are 2 or 3 things that we can do to help make this job something that you're really excited to do. So again, there's some model and some training and some work that can be done in that space to help make that happen. So here's an exercise. I'll give you a little time to think this through. We're not going to go into groups or anything today because we don't have time for that. But I'll just have you do this a little bit on your own, and then we can have you share a little bit if you're willing to do that as well. So think of a workplace situation where you felt different from everyone else on the job. So just take a moment to think about that, and I'll take a sip of tea as you do that. So as you're thinking about that, now think about, and maybe even write this down. This can be really helpful to just put this down on paper. But what are the feelings and emotions that you experienced in that moment? So when you felt different from everyone else on the job, what were some of the feelings and emotions that you experienced? Just give you a second to do that. As you're writing some of those down, why do you think this situation brought these feelings up for you? So now it's the why. So we have the what those feelings were, naming them. Now thinking about why those came up for you. And then lastly, what impact did the experience have on your job performance or your career with that organization? So I know for me, for a long time in the corporate world, I was always the single guy. And I worked in a kind of a smaller town environment, which was not a problem, but it was a very family oriented. Everyone was kind of having kids and getting married and that type of thing. And oftentimes I kind of felt othered because I was different than them. And for me, I'll just kind of share my experience. That made me feel, obviously I felt different, but the feelings that came up for me were loneliness, because I was off on my own, and I felt, I guess, being different made me feel different as well. And I think that brought up feelings for me as I was going through my coming out phase from being a gay man. And I think the impact that had for me was I started to realize that I didn't fit in that organization. I think I also tried to fit in for a while. So I was what was called code switching, which means I was trying to be more masculine, or whatever the word, macho, than I really was. It was a very masculine type of environment, a very competitive environment. And I probably amped that up in myself, even though that's not really me. And so that was my experience with that. So we'll have some time at the end if anybody wants to share their experience with the group here in a couple of minutes. We'll have about, I'll probably be done here in about 5 or 6 minutes. And if anyone else wants to share, they're welcome to do so. So keep your notes and your thoughts if you'd like to do that. So bringing your whole self to work. A couple things to keep in mind. Ask yourself, what do I choose to censor at work? What might others, and then, so this is about you, but what might others be censoring at work because it is out of the norm? And again, that has more to do with the culture. What doesn't fit the culture? And that might tell you a little bit about what others have to censor when they're at work. What do they keep away from the workplace? What do they decide not to reveal about themselves? Because when we're doing those things, we're not bringing our whole selves to work, right? And so that's why, again, whether it's a manager or a coworker, building those personal relationships with each other is so important to be able to talk this through and work it out. And then as an organization, and we think about our culture, how do we widen that net and make more and more people feel like they belong and that they can bring their whole selves to work, all of their talents can come to bear. Another thought about this comes from Parker Palmer, who's written some wonderful books on belonging and whole self. And that's about how organizations help people bring their whole selves to work. And I love this quote: discovering vocation does not mean scrambling towards some prize just beyond my reach, but accepting the treasure of true self I already possess. And how often do we find ourselves doing what society or the organization or other people are pushing us to do, rather than going inside of ourselves and doing what is authentic to us? So again, that whole piece of self-awareness is so incredibly important in being grounded in oneself. So when we talk about employee development, certainly we need to develop in terms of skills and things of that nature, but also developing ourselves from the inside out is equally important, because that'll help us be vulnerable enough to create that sense of belonging with others once we are grounded in who we are. And this is also a really neat quote I like in a really wonderful book that Timothy Clark wrote on the 4 stages of psychological safety. And the first step in psychological safety is what he calls inclusion safety. So what do people on your team need to do to earn inclusion safety? And Clark tells us that it should be simple. Number 1, being a human, and number 2, being harmless. That's all it should take to be included or to feel a sense of inclusion. So does it require more on your team where you work for somebody to be, feel included? Again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but in a previous role, it was clear to me in a previous role that I was in that people had to dress a certain way, talk a certain way, have a certain persona. Again, it was a very masculine, competitive type of environment. And again, kind of going back now to that environment and that little culture that was built within that particular team I was on, we're all human. And as long as we're harmless, we should be included. Now, there are other levels of psychological safety that and some of those other levels need to be earned around challenger safety and other things that Clark talks about. But inclusion isn't one of them. Inclusion is as long as you're human and you're harmless, you should feel like you're included. So those are a couple things to keep in mind. So again, how do we disrupt this disconnect? I call it a disconnection crisis. There are a couple things to keep in mind. Just a couple tips. And we do this in our classes in our MBA program. And in our MBA program are people out in the workforce working all day long and coming in the evenings around 5:30 into a Zoom session just like this. And we always start off with a check-in. How are you feeling? And we give everyone the opportunity to check in. And oftentimes people come in and they're like, I'm not feeling very good. I have a headache, or this happened to me at work. Or people come in and they're jazzed and they're like, oh my gosh, I got interviewed for a new job. So they're sharing something about themselves. And it's amazing that so many of them, as we get to the end of a course, are like, I'm really going to miss the check-ins more than anything. So certainly we're learning a few things, hopefully in the classes that we teach, but that experience around the check-in is incredibly powerful, especially as you build that as a norm within your team. And people really start sharing things about themselves. And then you really build deeper connections with each other. And again, I'll just share it from our classroom experience. That's all done on Zoom with adults that are in the workforce. They're at kind of a tough time in their day. They've worked all day. They're coming in at 5:30, trying to get a bite to eat. And they can't wait to check in and find out from their classmates how their days are going as well. There are other types of check-ins I think that managers should keep in mind. So that might be one that would be done in a weekly meeting as an example. But I think managers have to, especially when we're working remotely, have to be reminded that there should be really daily check-ins. And it doesn't mean that you have to have a meeting set up or anything of that nature, but just a quick email, a text, a quick call. How are you doing today? And again, being a manager, being a leader is a choice. So if people are like, oh, I don't have time, or that's not me. Again, I think it's important to say this is an expectation. If you're going to be a leader here, it's a choice. And these are the things that are needed out of a manager, especially a modern leader in today's world. And then I also think it's important to not just say that's enough, but I think having something weekly, even on the calendar, whether it's a 10 or 15 or even a 30-minute check-in, that's a little bit more robust, is also very important. You know, what's going well for you this week? What's difficult? What are your challenges? What are your obstacles? How can I help? Again, servant leadership is not something that happens once a week. It happens daily, but this once a week check-in can really take just a little bit more time to help that employee know that somebody cares and that somebody is willing to step in and assist when needed. And then lastly, having something either monthly or quarterly, maybe for 30 minutes or 60 minutes is important because we have longer term career aspirations. We have longer term goals. Those daily and weekly check-ins are really meant to deal with in the moment issues that employees are experiencing. How do we step out of the moment and think about what we're doing in the bigger picture? And that's where the monthly and quarterly check-ins in meetings can be really powerful between an employee and their manager. So again, working with those frontline managers is really important to help with those things. And then how can we do this from an organizational standpoint? So again, we can work with direct managers, but there are also some things that can happen on the organizational level to help support that type of culture that you're trying to build. And one can be an engagement platform. So there are technologies that are out there that can help make employee recognition really easy. Giving somebody points or an e-card or things along that nature, making sure we don't miss an employee milestone date, whether it's a birthday or some kind of achievement that they've been made. Technology can help build those reminders in so that those peer-to-peer recognitions can take place as well. And then social connections. Again, we're not necessarily bumping into each other at the water cooler, showing each other pictures of our families on our phones, but there are ways on a digital platform where people can kind of build a more personal level of culture there around posting photos and e-cards and things of that nature. And then, surprise and delight. What are we going to do that's out of the ordinary? Somebody doesn't expect to get, a North Face jacket with the company logo on it, or even something smaller like, something in the mail that's going to be just, a little tumbler or something like that reinforces the brand of the company, but also is just a nice little gesture or a little gift card like, hey, go out to lunch. Here's a $10 gift card, something along that nature. And then, deeper work can be done on the strategic level as well around creating inclusive cultures. and really digging into underlying beliefs of that culture, and trying to find out if some adjustments need to be made. But then also espousing the values of the company again, and then getting to changing policies and practices. So there's kind of a process for making sure that that's done in a authentic way, but also one that's done in a way that creates a sustainable change within that culture. We don't have time to dive into all the steps in that process, but this is a framework for how we think about doing those things. So with that, that's the content that I have put in for you today. And I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time here at the end for questions or comments. So I will stop sharing my screen and see if anyone would like to share any insights that they have on building a more inclusive and belonging culture, or any questions that they might have.
Rob, Zachary Campbell here.
Yeah.
Wanting to ask you a question about, as you're talking there, I got really excited about activities. So either you or anyone from the group, what types of activities or practices can help strengthen this sense of belonging? As a counselor, I've got ideas about different practices, but as a business manager, it's always good to see the practicality of it.
Yeah, like a real life type of activity you can do with a group of employees.
Yep.
Let's see if anyone in the group would like to jump in with an idea before I do. Feel free to unmute and share something that's worked well for you. As you're thinking about that, you know, I mentioned the check-in, and that's just a good, I think, regular practice. Another one that, you know, we've done, you know, personality assessment, you know, can be kind of fun activities. There's a cost to that sometimes, but people learning about different communication styles with each other can create self-awareness, but also awareness within a team. Are you more extroverted, introverted? You know, things like that can be really helpful in personal development. Those can be half-day or day-long activities. Something a little shorter that I've done that helps build trust and personal connection is, it's not really an icebreaker so much, but we've gone around and shared things like, hey, today we're going to go around and do something totally different. We're going to share something from your childhood that you had to overcome. And that can really bring out some really interesting conversation and deep meaning for people. Or I've had a CEO start off that conversation and say, well, I was bullied as a kid, and kind of went into a long story about that. And the other team members were like, whoa, now I know that, you know, why you react sometimes the way you do, like, you know, because sometimes he would come aggressively into a situation and it was because he felt like somebody was getting picked on or something along that nature. So I see some are flowing into the chat as well. Have you done anything yourself, Zachary, you know, that's worked well?
Yeah, I've worked as a manager for mental health organizations, and some of the psychodrama techniques I've implemented is sharing in a way that is using just looks of faces rather than words. So as we out of a group of maybe 25, 30, you have 4 or 5 that volunteer to say, show me what belonging looks like. And then they just act it by their either face or facial expression, or, you know, so it encourages communication without necessarily showing deep vulnerability to warm people up. And then we process and talk about what that experience was as an entire group. And hopefully that can help engage a more deeper and trusting connection rather than just, hey, let's talk about what it means to belong. So you're actually, people acting can lower defenses.
Yeah.
So that's been really fruitful for me. And psychodrama has lots of different techniques, but that's just one.
I love that one. And there's one that's kind of, in a way, I don't want to say the opposite of that, but we've done some Bohemian dialogue circles before too, which can be kind of interesting, and they work online pretty well. And that's where you can ask people, kind of like that exercise that I shared earlier, but this is kind of where you actually turn your cameras off. And then there's just a lot of silence and people think differently. And it's also sometimes called a campfire dialogue. So it's kind of, if you kind of remember like being around a campfire, you're not reacting and looking at each other, but people are sharing stories. So if you wanted someone to share a story of, maybe where they didn't feel like they fit in, and kind of through those questions that I asked earlier in the exercise, that can be like a nice, deep, rich conversation in a safe place for people to share as well. So I kind of like the scenario where people are reacting visually to each other, but then there's the other one where people are listening deeply to each other too. There are different activities like that as well. And then there's some really good ones here in the chat, it looks like, as well. Yeah, the appreciative one, Carissa puts in there, doing appreciations with each other can be a really, really great one to warm up with each other. That's a great question. Thanks, Zachary. Other questions or comments from the group?
I would just add on maybe a little to what Zachary's question was, just with a thought. When we did that thought exercise, you're talking about thinking about a place, a time when you haven't necessarily felt that sense of belonging. And I'm a Lead for Minnesota fellow serving North Span. And I just started in August. So I've been here about 6 months, but coming into this position, I was the only one in my office kind of working on the type of work that I was doing. So they do a lot of business consulting, banking stuff, a whole bunch of different things that I'm completely unrelated to. So I'm working on welcoming communities. So just this huge disconnect between the type of work that my coworkers were doing. But I think some of you might know Alyssa Hansen. She's the president and CEO of North Span. She has kind of created this culture of belonging, I think, where at first I was put into some of these meetings. We would have kind of these check-ins, like you were talking about, these weekly, monthly check-ins. And I'm like, I don't even know what I'm doing here. People are talking about things I have nothing to do with. I don't even understand what they're saying. So some of those feelings of like isolation or confusion, but just being in those meetings and being given an opportunity to share, hey, Amber, what are you working on? Even though we're not working on the same things, but kind of building that relationship. I've now realized how much that has built that sense of belonging. Even though our work is not the same, we have that kind of relationship foundation that has given kind of that sense of belonging in my 6 months there. So not any big activities necessarily or specific, I like the ideas that were given of those different, activities you can engage in, but just some of these kind of normalizing activities being put in places, with other people, just to have that relationship building.
Yeah, when you do it on a regular basis, it really builds on each other. And like you said, it's part of what we do. And I really look forward to it now, that type of thing. And for a new person jumping into that culture, it's a lot more welcoming too. So I'm glad you had a wonderful experience with that. That's great. Well, I don't know, Chris, do we need to wrap up here? I see you're on camera, so I don't want to go over if we should not be doing that.
We're great on time. We have another minute. So you're welcome to stay a minute if you have another question, but if not, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Randall. This was a really engaging and wonderful presentation. You provided a lot of tactical advice. You're vulnerable, and so thank you. This was really wonderful. And a thank you to the Stender School of Business and Technology for your sponsorship. So I will hopefully share the slides following the presentation, and we appreciate you being here. So
it's great to see you all, and here's to a good 2022. Hope you all stay safe, healthy, and happy.
This was a great way to start.